Setting up alignments and sending a sequence lines to panel operation screens is knowing exactly how to come in and modification grounds of everything information system of travel. So we have to understand how to get a gravitational pull, line position location of a system with all the settings. The calculator modifies the archetypes, gravitates the pull centers, lines of travel that sets the compulsories, and that communicates the setting that sets the paradigms, the polar shifts, and the compulsories, and line screen adaptations, the flux over set tractions. There's two communication lines of screens. Now we have to understand how to modify that and set all communication to its planetary lines into its constellation lines of wind path. This opens the communication system of the calculations. All right, so let's get into the platforms of E lines. You guys have a test on Friday lines into planetary lines, solar system lines of travel. So planetary lines of 1, process of 2, process of 3, center lines of communications. Set lines of graphs, center screen adaptations of flux over lines, and road graph screens. 3 lines of measure, 4 lines of settings, process calculations, process lines of angles, and travel communications. All right? Setting up a solar sail and rotation surface and travel. Okay, now directing alignments is of course lines of channel that sets the communication system off through setting through an operation lines of sequence of 45 line rotations, setting different angles and screens, and flux over lines and set tractions. Okay, high signal lines of the eyes. High signal locates the setting to its cataract, directs the centers of operation sequence, has 3 scales to 3 measures, and rotation surface and travel off the calculation setting. Process line of satellites rotates the systems off the calculated system off the travel. Connected to its ground centers of surface. Process calculates lines, simulation grounds, and rotation set tractions into your solar streams. Directing lines and pixelation particle string lines and set lines of travel in the communication system off the travel. Okay, center op, center positions. This is where we come into equal line centers, equilibrium performance. How we come to equal line. Okay, through all settings. Truly getting position location to its system all through its alignments, right? So these are the transits, these are the divots. Okay. If you understand a location, you understand a scanner. Now the scanner has point graphs. It's a communication system. So anything in the divots is calculated to modify through capillaries, to your immune, to your dietary, anything to your nervous systems, or anything in track centers, location systems. So how this is set up is all through point graph communications. And on how to energize, teleport, teleweave, telecommunicate, code weaving, line screen adaptation systems, all through settings. E factors are a setting and process communication system, all through travel. It says calculation ground, says service and track communications, all through setting. Okay. Now, bring it in. There's the sequence lines of communication system of travel. Okay. So we get a bridging lines of 1, bridging lines of 3, process lines of 6 over setting, right? 3 lines of course centers. Okay, so we set this line calculation setting to Orion's belt. 1, 2, 3 lines of scale. Okay. Okay, we open signals. We cross the angles and we communicate to higher lines of settings and sequence over screen. Okay. Now, communicate to ground centers comes in lines of tether, process lines of transistors over resistors. 1 setting of flux. Process the indication system, 2-point graphs, 3 calculation lines, transistors over resistors, and screen adaptations of travel. Okay. All right, so the indicate setting to probing is a high lines detection screen. Center lines of green centers, process lines of 3 centers of value, process line course centers, and direct signal lines of grounds. The oscillation wind paths change the constellation system and travels and communicates center interference in 12 centers of signal locates the setting of traffic lights. Okay. Process that position location, change the angles, point communications inside and outside rotation. Okay. So this is how a bridge is set up, lines of cells, divots over transitions over lines of transactions, knowing a line communication transference that puts the transcendence and location system all through set positions. The operates line course centers, calculate and modify, set one location of its receivers, directing centers lines, over line sequence, over lines of panels, and part of acceleration. Sending trap point lines of graph, 3 centers, line position lines of programming, directing lines into universal lines, purple over 1, purple over 3, and purple over 6 over travel. Directing ground centers, set position location to its operation line signings, sets communication sending to its Orion's belt and set position. Okay. Isolation line screens, adaptation lines, traffic to highways, line rotation system in all set positions. Charter markers, directing lines of flux over line and traffic over indication setting to travel. Okay. Setting location system and your planetary system and set calculation, your planets. Okay, so we've got two green line centers, rotation lines of flux over Pluto, directing ground center, set position, location, and system of settings. Modify the cloak and dagger, process lines of 1, process lines of 4, process lines of 6, and process lines of 12 in travel. Okay, calculate and modify galaxy line shift lines of anomaly. 3 centers operation lines of sequence. Now we codify the formula through equation location system. Process lines of 2, process lines of 3, process lines of 6 over set positions. Set calculation lines of Pluto, correlations of Saturn. Set signals, ground center and service location setting, 45 line angles and traffic communications. Okay. Directing lines inside rotation and travels in communication system. So the higher you go, this is where it comes into graphs, set location and setting. Scriptures and tablets. Set lines in high position location, its templates. Directing ground centers and hieroglyphics, course lines of channels and pyramid activation lines, rotation, spin cycles, process indication system, all through settings. Sets the data formation lines and wave and screen adaptations of mapping. Mapping sequence, and then we go through hard charge waves, set position over lines of 1, 2, mapping of 4, 6, 8, 12, setting graph line course centers and location system to a mapping sequence that correlates the setting in line rotation system, all through tractions, all through locations, into its country set rotation centers and travel. Its map. Process calculation lines of ground, sets communication system, all through setting. Operation line sequence, location setting, delta heading. Tango Foxtrot, Hotel Golf, sets course centers, line communication setting. Measure and scale, process line indicates setting, process line security, outline centers, and rotation system, and travel. Setting bolts and communication lines, information lines of grounds, set communication system, all through settings, through volume and mass, and location system, through constellation. Okay. Then we communication lines of QR coding, course centers, line communication lines of pink outline centers, 3 signals and 3 travels. Sets bypassing lines, heart reactor timelines, heart reactor line rotations, and line rotations, volume inset lines of sequence and calculation. All right. Change the angles, point centers, outline centers, inside rotations. There's the mapping panels, electrical line infusion, location setting, travel. Okay, line indicators. Okay, so let's get in signal location setting to its all line course centers, alpha and beta. Beta wave comes in, over lines, cross lines, and signature lines of ground center locations of bridging and set tractions. Bridging lines of sequence, process lines of cells. Now that divots location system, all through travel. Directing lines of 1 center, 1 travel. 2 centers, operation, 3 set calculations. All right. Course and channels, there it is. There's the transitions over screen. And we go through red line centers and rotation inside, inline, outline set calculation, screen adaptation. Process, position, location, travel. Okay, so that's the primer, that's a primer, and 3 centers of circuits and travel communications. All right. Calculate and modify, change the angles, point graphs, over lines of red, over lines of sequence, over green, purple line rotations. There's a mapping panel, a process calculation, same lines, and set tractions and direction. All right. Okay, so we go to the central setting, which is the course centers into constellation lines of patterns. Now we go through the formula line course centers. It gets more complicated because now we go through E force, set lines of E, process lines of F, F lines of G. Question mark. 2 factors over setting, 3 centers over attractions, directing ground centers, high sequence in constellation 1, process lines of 12, 24 scale, set lines of 0, fields of energy, set core lines of 0 fields of clocking, 0 fields of foundations, 0 fields of planets, and planetary alignments, and traffic communication setting, and sequence lines of communications. All done through equation. It's all set up. All right. Bring it in, you can see the central setting of its mapping system. Okay, very, very powerful stuff. Row graphs. There's the central course centers, line direct signals, the 3 lines of flux over screen. And set tractions. All right. So I'll set up lines of mapping and process calculations. All right. So configuration system comes to calculation lines of grounds. Sets communication line transits over divots over cross screens. Have a triangulation of flux over line into process lines of 1 center, 1 traction, 1 division, 1 locations. All through acceleration lines of setting. Okay. Bring in line, Set lines of communication, one service, one traction. All right, so let's get into transition lines. Now, waving screens comes into lines of light, into lines of dark, position lines of light waving, dark waving. Process lines indicates setting, 99 flux. Set course centers, 98,000 line measure, and scale. Sets communication lines of 1 and 2 and 3 centers of travel. Okay? Setting course lines and direct signals of grounds and set position of clocking lines of setting. Correlate the system and time frame in center operation sequence. Cross lines of green, over line screen adaptation system and track locations. Central line communication setting bold volumes, green centers, sets calculated setting, and sequence lines of panel operates the set positional location of its tether. Attachments, screen lines, adaptations of flux over line. Setting line rotations and travel. Directing ground centers into line positions, atom, molecules, and protons and electrons. Directing ground centers highlights a sequence. Now, cells modification lines of divots have transitions over lines over pi. Center cover centers of zero gravity, zero lines of travel. Constellation lines into capillaries, directing lines into proxy. Proxy set lines of travels, endpoint communication lines, inside line rotations of box frames. Sets calculation of ground centers, highline signals into one center, one traction, one division location system of the calculations of the setting, right? Setting lines of location of its mapping setting in rotation service and travel. And set positions. That equation. Okay. That's all the inside line setting, inside rotation. All right. Now we go through solar graph, 45 line centers into the solar system and solar generation lines that allocates time frame locations existing all at once in one universal lines of grounds. Oh, look at that, disappeared. Traveling too fast. Let's do it again and set position constellation. All right, set up. All right. Spin the cycles, rotation line screens into mapping line rotation into 45 line screens, adaptations of flux over setting and travel. All set calculation. And then we come into the road graph screens and 3 signals and 3 grounds of surface and travel. Okay, and then we come in dimensional line centers of dimensional doors and coloration lines of patterns of light metaphors. There's the door. Right, and then you have to understand the position locations of 2 doors in sequence and set positions. Okay, and then we go through patterns of behavior, rotate the cycles and 3 lines of grounds and set position lines of 2 travel. Sets course lines of channel, set lines communicate setting and triangulation lines of flux. Directing ground centers, online sequence and triangulation lines of up and set position of sequence. Setting communicates height centers and location setting to its direction of time frame, sets panels of operation screen adaptations of setting. 3 centers operation, inside line condition setting, mapping sequence to set calculation lines and direct signal. Okay. Spin cycles on line centers of 0 lines and fields. Set sequence lines of 1 center. Indicates settings of flux. Pi generation lines of solar line 1. Process line indicates system of all genetic lines of screen. Okay, so we have cell modification lines of 2 panels, mass equations. Flux over 3 centers in position of 2 set lines, 3 centers, 3 communications, 0 field of energy. Sets calculation of center operations setting of plateaus of platforms. Directing ground centers of surface and travel communications. Now, directing link process indicates system of planetary line centers in set travel communications and set positions. All right, so your planets are there in setting. You are in sequence lines of panel. Process here. Getting rid of it attached and set traction communications and direction. So there's solar system, there's you. Right? Outline centers, inside rotations. Attached to set position location of 5 lines and setting at 12. All through setting, all through operation, right? All through a mapping sequence of seconds, minutes, hours, and frame. Okay? Very powerful stuff, guys. Very powerful stuff. Now we have volume and mass. And this is what it looks like in travel. Okay, and this is what it looks like in travel, and direct signals and grounds, and set travel communications, all through setting, all through operation. Transits over line, X-ray line, platform, and scanner. Scanner communicates with system, all through settings. The operation line sequence sets lines with volume. Okay, 13 scale, 14 measure, 15 measure, 16 volume, 0.24, 48 scales, 72 computer lines into 144. Frames per line, frames per second, set correlations of minutes and hours and tractions, indirect signals and grounds. Set calculation lines, operation lines, flux over 1, solar generation lines of 2, process inside rotations of 3 and travel. Okay? Okay. So we're going to go through bullet screens of 144, 1 angle, 2 point lines of graphs, equal lines equation. 2 indicates a system of 4 centers, 3 centers of mass, and 3 core centers lines of travel. Okay, allocate time finds, position line flights, manifestation system lines of travels, point communications, and 1 center of travel communications. Okay, coming to core centers of compass over 72 flux, 4 line centers, 8 lines of attractions, overline signal, overlines of travel. Directing ground centers and calculation setting, face recognition. Okay, communications sending the brain, set lines and signals into membrane core centers, brainstem. Process indicate lines, screen adaptation of center operation line sequence, solar panels and 3 travels in point communication lines of pyramid and flux. Sets travel communication lines of grounds. Set the operation line sequence. Communicate the sun codes, directing lines and line positions, all levels of measure. Flux over 3 of centers, point lines of set lines, equilibrium, performance, and its efficacy in travel communications. Directing ground centers, high sequence location setting into time measure, time scales, time patterns, mapping and set travel communications. Oscillation winds, directing ground centers of set position location to its systems, all through alpha tone and travel. Process lines indicates setting of flux over lines and 1 lines of indication. All right, so we go through red, indicates the line security, process lines over signal. Let's get into travel communications, inside line settings. Okay, and then we go into the blue line, into position location setting, metric chord, sets simulation lines and string theory. Signal lines, directing signal location setting in hours of minutes and frames, seconds over line core centers and line conditions. Okay, then we set up your planetary lines. We outline scale process on 1, 2, and 3 centers of travel. Okay. Sets calculation of grounds, sets communication system, all through tether and attachment. Okay, indicates ground centers, set locations, and settings of travel. Outside provision and set directions. Right there in set position, all right? Okay, so we cross the angles. We set lines of course centers of divots, screen centers lines of 1, process lines of indication center, 8 line centers of rotation lines of spins. Sets course centers, flux over 1, process of 2, and configuration of face lines, and direct lines of ground communications and settings. Set sequence, electrical line grids, course centers lines of travel. Now, it gets interesting too because the metric meters and scales of its tethers tracks its set course centers, location of time and scale. Process indicates the system of these settings into triangulation lines of 1 center, 1 sequence, 1 panel. Door records a time frame. Sets calculations of frames over line, fields of nothing, travels of everything. Ground centers of service, process lines indicates the setting of 1, 2, 3, and 4, and line position 6 and set tractions. Directing ground centers, high line signals, into all line rotations, into northern lights. Setting travel and then communication system, all through travel. Points lines of graph indicates setting. All through setting, all through operation. Triangulation flux over set lines in position. And track course centers and pyramid activation line, rotational line, course centers, light shades and shadows and travel. Directing ground centers of service, sets mapping sequence, and travel communications. All through setting, all through operation. All right, so it's about understanding divots and davits and knowing how to go through that line rotations and travel and direct signal location systems, its mapping setting location to its PI and generation screens. All right, so once you indicate the screen lines, it operates the signal location system off the centers, the process and that core centers, but it's tethers, lines to inhibitors, and it's crossing angles. So it sets communication lines as body frame. That's correlate the travels. Set position of sequence, 3 panels operation lines of flux. Now we have 2 centers of charge, supercharged over 1 center operation lines of question. As a direct line link, right? Process lines of 1, 0, set lines of 0 lines of 1, 0 fields of set track communications. Now directing lines of link is a flux line at 3 line signal locations set in capacitor travel. Directing ground centers has high position location of systems, all through its intelligence information lines of grounds. Sets calculation lines into elliptical screens, time reactor, and set operation line sequence, and set communications any constellation lines of oscillation system. Sets calculation lines of solar panels, set correlation setting, either position lines of 5 settings, as tractors communication lines of planetary, rotate to spin, and rotation lines of 45 angles and travel communications. Directing ground centers, let's change the angles, point lines of setting. The simulation course sets communication of time frame and set tractions. Directing ground centers is set position to its operation service, all through setting through satellite. There's a satellite. 3 signals, 3 grounds, and set travel. Okay, done by equation, right? That's set in sequence, set in operation line condition system, all through solar communications, right? All right, process lines of direct signals. We set up another mapping line center. The process lines is zero field energy. The process lines is zero travel. We get a field lines into 34 centers, directing lines of 2 centers times 2 times 1. Sets calculation 1 frame, 1 traction, 1 set locations, and 4 settings of platforms of travel. All right, so we take the oscillation lines, 2 equals equations, and 4 centers of measure, and 4 calculation setting, and 4 communication lines of travel. Okay, setting ground centers, tether lines, webbing lines of 1, webbing lines of 2, webbing lines of 3, docking lines of 4, 6, 8, and 12 travel communications. Okay, webbing screens and direct signals through mapping lines of pi into a solar grid panel. Okay, so we go through the webbing screens, adaptation lines of alpha, process lines of 1, 2, and 3 lines of scale, process lines of indication system, right? Oscillation lines are lines, location setting, and position lines of travel. Directing ground centers, high sequence lines of panel, process indication system, all through tractions. Constellation winds, mapping lines, rotation line signings, high rotation line condition setting to its atmospheres and travel. Directing ground centers of service, process lines, position location system, all through setting, all through operation line sequence, and zero field of energy. Done. So it's really understand how to use a mapping sequence, how to coordinate that line communication with its webbing screen adaptations of flux. Indicates settings of travels and directs lines of grounds into high course centers lines of communications, all through setting, right? All right. As we go through the pyramid activation lines, the cosmic flame, the cosmic set course centers, serpent flames, and serpent track location lines of serpent chart and highways, as an infinity line rotation, 1 spin cycle, 1 traction, right? Directing lines of energy line and position location and travel line, direct lines of center operation lines of 3 travels and set positions. Set calculation lines of grounds, flywheel line rotation center and travel communication lines of balance, directing over line rotation set calculation center console, directing ground centers and set position location setting and configure system all through face recognition of time frame. Okay, face recognition. Time sequence times calculation setting. Okay. All right, so we set the oscillation wind pass, process lines of solar line centers into your solar panels, solar mediums, solar graphs into solar systems of communication. Sets communication lines of tether, 3 centers of travel, sets lines of past, present, future, set course centers, travel lines, center line, operation line, sequence, and set calculations. Directing ground centers, you process communication lines of settings, operation lines of sequence, and communication system to your satellites. Directing ground centers, high calculation setting, 3 lines of tether, process lines of 4 over measure, and scale communication lines of platforms. Sets calculation lines of ground centers and oscillation line rotations, sets communication system, all through tractions, all through locations. Body frame is now attached and location setting to solar system and travel. All setting, done. It's all set up in wires of indication setting into your sky grid. Okay, it's all set travels into your waving panels of your window frames into sky grid. Sets of course centers of time and frame lines of triangulation of direction of time frames of sky grid. So sets calculation screen lines and adaptations of flux over setting and travel communication system all through operation. All through setting, all through attachment, all through tether. All through done by equation, right? Done. All right, this is all recognized in time frame, knowing how to correlate the setting lines of space lines, time lines, inhibitors, and in location the auxiliaries, and location system when it comes to interactions. So we get into barcode recognition of time frame. Central circuits, mainframe, core settings, and operation lines, panels and screen lines of 3 lines of travels, and 3 graph communications, right? Directing lines, information lines, box frames, window frames, over cross location setting a travel communication system. Right? Process indication lines of solar lines, screen adaptations and line centers, sets course centers and time frame, operation sequence, operation panels, set lines and settings, and dimensional line rotation sail, sets communication setting and grounds of set tractions. All right? Bring it in, there it is, the mapping sequence of communications off their travel. Okay? Try to understand the indication system when it comes to time frame, location, or highways. Right? 2 triangulation lines of flux over setting. Right? Now, indicating that is knowing how to change the time locks. time editing, time processing, line signal location system, author set positions to its operation sequence, location of its setting. All right. All right, so this is where you come into 6 habitation zones of your Earth, or process the indication setting and ground center locations. All right, so it's set lines of red. Okay. Set positions of Pluto, right? Okay, so Pluto is going to be connecting the high center locations. Setting travel point lines of grav and center calculation setting location system. Now, calculate and modify has the lines of volume, that lines of sequence, lines of 3 centers of scale that cause its calculation setting. So in that communication setting comes an opposition location system, while through travels into high course centers, line position location in Neptune. Remember, it's all in 3 indication settings of 2 lines of flux over a setting with a line position of 7 over lines of 5 over 12 into 24 lines of scale. It's calculated and modifies Pluto, location Neptune, into travel point line centers, travel lines and green lines of service, outline signal, inline outline set traction communications, directing lines of grounds. Then we change the formation lines of time frame and set travel. Okay, sets calculation and ground centers, line communication lines of Mercury. Mercury comes in position location system. Mercury's line screen comes in all communication setting into ground sequence and line signal location over cross line condition setting to 2 planetary rotation lines of travel. Sets calculation and ground centers of server location system. So calculate and modify sets 3 lines of setting to tether. The attached course centers in oscillation wind path put position of galaxy lines alignment and 3 centers of operation sequence. That process line calculation setting. Formula equation lines of E factors over line oscillation line winds into proxy channels, directing lines in the capillaries. Now the capillaries course centers sets lines of course centers and direct signal lines of grounds. It correlates the setting of planetary line set location lines of 6 lines. Time sequence times 2. That's process lines and line condition setting over 8 lines of measure, 8 lines of scale, 8 lines of position, 8 lines of locations. Setting communicates in high center location setting. So it communicates in high centers, comes into Jupiter. Now Jupiter is a surfacing engine that processes indication centers and direct signal line position, location, and scales, and communication setting of service. Locking sequence, locking panels, locking operation line centers, line communication lines of sequence. Let's get into ground center lines of service. Okay, I can modify Jupiter and center operation line settings and set tractions. Jupiter and set position. Okay, now broadening lines of Mercury, course centers lines of Neptune, locations of Pluto, is an energized screen adaptation of Jupiter and the surfacing engine. That process all communicates the system. 3 centers lines in Orion's belts, 4 lines in its calculation screen adaptation to flux. Sets course centers, line communicates the system. Now we have the sun line. Sun communicates to its system all through attractions and directions into cubing. All right, here's the position of the sun and moon into together and force line connections. All right. Process, calculation lines, directing lines, and position location and system all through set positions. Travel point lines of graph, 6 lines of scale. Set positions of 1, and travel in that communicates the system all through setting. Operation lines, oscillation wind paths, location system all through calculations. All right, now we change the graphs. There's the solar system in travel. Very complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun. All right, so that indicates lines of Jupiter has a surface and edge lines, a flux over line and flux line center location setting off through travel. Now, directing link, we process the angle point graphs. This is 0 gravity, 0 set line communication, 0 fields. Setting lines of 0 clocking, center communication setting, and travel in line rotations of Saturn. Sets course centers, constellation line, circulation and rotation system, and position location set tractions. Now we allocate timeline. Now time frame lines has a box frame. We allocate timeline centers and relation lines of rotors and routers. Sets course centers of modem, Wi-Fi, satellites, and towers, and windows and frame. Process the indication system, inside line condition system, all through tractions, and 45 communication system, all through setting, all through operation. Directing ground centers of set positions. The X2000 comes information lines of 1 outside and 1 inside rotation inside the planetary surface and travel. Directing ground centers of service rotates the surface of travel in that course centers of coordinates. Directing ground centers in position of 360 lines north, set lines of 250 lines south, east line coordinates, directing lines of 222, planetary lines into 5 hours of sequence, 5 lines of measure, 5 light years away, bypassing line course centers, Schumann resonance, and 3 grounds of set position lines of measure and scale. Process the indication system in setting to its rotation system all through alpha and delta. Set correlates the lines of travel, set lines of 1, process lines of D over factors. Solar sail, direct centers of yin and yang, and set course centers of travel and direct signal location system through volatile Gulf. Process the indication system all through center of operation sequence. Planetary setting, all through alignment. Done by equation. All right, so you set a course center yin and yang is the Earth itself. The planet through lines of blue, 7 lines of charge. Directing indication, notification, setting, acceleration lines of time. 7 lines of 7 water sequence and communicate setting, 100 lines of flux into water containment setting and locate setting to H2O and travel communications. Center operation lines of 1. Okay, so we got brown centers, a process line indicates lines into modification flux. Of course, centers line direct signals of 5 scales into Earth line rotations and 6 habitations into 6 inhabitation zone and travel communications. Setting direct line grounds, we go into the green. Now this course center location system of the settings. The operator's line greens correlates to forestry, directing centers of its alignments and time lines. Come to all course centers of 0 calculation setting into communication setting and travel communication setting and travel. Okay? Okay, so the planetary alignments is set up now. I just have to send how to use it on a 45 line angle and travel communications. Very complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun. Directing ground centers is set position location system through solar systems. Calculated line screens is adaptation to processing line center location setting of Jupiter. Okay, so we go from line screens in constellation of 2 centers. Process lines 1, process lines of 2, 3 lines of scale. Okay? Oh, wait, look at that. We lost that, right? Because it's not ready in frequency. Okay, so we have 3 ground centers, lines of set position location, equal line centers in line communication system off the green. Green comes in, outline, inline rotation setting, and flux. Process indication lines of box frames and locations and triangulation lines of communication lines of flux. Okay, so we change the time scale. Process the indication system all through Jupiter in 3 centers of alignments and setting a traffic highway. Highways, tethers, lines attached as lines inside, outside measure, outside scale, outside positions. 3 centers of circuits and travel. Okay? Directing ground centers set this location is wires of indication setting to its convergence system of the attractions, alpha and beta. Alpha and beta comes in line centers of delta. Delta online cross lines, line rotation lines, and line dislocation infinity line. Rotation lines and directing offline, inside line rotation setting to its data formation lines of its highway. Setting course lines of channel, directing lines of link, and process indicates the system all through travel, all through flux. Directing lines of all signal locations, portals, and stargates, all settings, all through operation. Setting sequence lines of panel. All right, setting ground centers is 0 and set travel communications. All right, set position lines 0 fields, 0 tractions, 0 communications, 0 clockings. 5 centers of 5 planets. Directing ground centers set positions, operation line sequence. Calculates lines, set correlation setting to travel. Sets position of the 3 lines of travel, 6 lines of setting, 6 lines of measure, 8 lines of scale. Process indication lines of volume, sets indication lines and positional levels into Fibonacci, 3 centers of travel, 4 centers, and 5 line communication system. Right? Change time frame, locking centers of travel communications. Right? Okay, so this gets complicated now. Now we just have forming lines, directing signal location of grounds, set position of 1, 2, and 3 centers of scale. Sets calculation of ground centers, set lines of sequence, location setting, and tether communication. Process the indication setting of Jupiter rising and travel communications. Okay, so it arrow indicates lines of 4 centers, 6 lines of measure, 4 scales of communication lines of setting. Processing indication setting 1, 2, 3, and 4 set travel. Okay, sets travels endpoint communication lines, indicates system all through travel communications of data. Sets calculation of grounds, operates lines of signals, solar system lines of travel, directing signals into lines of void, rotation line spin cycles, and set course centers of travel communicates inside traction. Directing lines of angles, inside rotations, into all communications of its travels in that lines of indication system through highways. 0 gravity, 0 point center line communications, the Merkaba. There's the Merkaba, all set up. Ground center security, blue line centers, green lines of sequence. Okay, processing indication system, all through travel. Teleportation vessel, capsule, line course centers, and line communication systems all through the set position of its vehicle. Setting course lines of channels, directing lines of links, process lines, and window frames and travel communication system all through traction. Directing ground centers, high signal location setting all through travel. Setting triangulation line condition system to all line rotation setting and communications. Set calculation lines of grounds and center operation lines of sequence and position lines of calculation. Directing ground centers, line communication system, all through setting, all through operation lines of setting. But there it is in set positions, all through travel, all through calculations. The set position location to its Merkaba. All set in traction. Done by equation, all through setting, all through operation to its system, to its planetary system of solar system. Okay? Woo! Fun, eh? It's great when you add color. I would say Earth is line rotating in seconds, minutes, and hours, and frames. It's time varying one case setting. We have zero gravity, zero correlations, zero foundations, zero clockings, and zero field energy now. All right, so we have direct lines of grounds, 3 centers of tether, past, present, and future adaptations. All done by equation. All right. Center up, calculates lines, solar track centers into Saturn lines of fast drive. Directing ground centers, line communication settings, solar system line rotations. Constellation wind pass process line direct signal location system all through setting. Sets line course centers. Setting direct lines of link, process lines of signals, process line calculations, process lines of set line communication setting of flux. Outline centers in sequence location system, all through attractions, all through locations, into your planetary alignments and set travel. Okay, done by equation. All right. Okay. Add that set up in line centers. We go through solar graph line centers. Okay, so we process the indicates ascending the flux over greens. Green centers over traction. The lines ascending process line indicates system all through travel and flux. Set calculation grounds, so go back in sequence, and we add course lines of green, green, and green. Set course centers lines in constellation wind pass. Process indicates a system all through settings, all through acceleration. Intelligence formation lines of 3 grounds. Set course centers. Time centers lines of 1, time centers lines of 2, process lines, coming to oculars, screen adaptation settings, spider ops, in that communication system, all through travel, and direct lines of communication system and traction. Right? Oculars come in, high formation setting, in travels, endpoint communications. All through sending, all through operation. That's set up and setting to travel into solar system track communications. All through operation. All right? Okay, we go to the hive. The hive indicates high centers of travel. We have a constellation wind line that communicates to its graph line. Okay, so as we come into zero calculation of fields, process indicates settings. Okay, sets lines of void. O sequence on line D, direction centers, intelligence lines, operation sequence, V vector, process lines, velocity, and line course centers in vacuum. Indicates grounds, high sequence into wave and charter waves and set calculations. Okay, sets lines of alpha, delta, and theta communications. All right. So we come into case lines of set traction communications. All right. So the solar system becomes line centers and constellations of copy and paste. 3 centers of value. Process indicates lines of kaleidoscope. Set course centers into hotel golf and travel. Sets lines of 1, process lines of 2. So your solar system is in a constellation line wind pass, and its formulas of equations of travel communications, all through direction. Right? Inside line condition setting to its mapping system of elliptical screen adaptation of the flux over travel. Sets calculation ground centers of the service of the system, all through measure, all through scale, all through communication system, all through setting. Done by equation. All right. Now this tracks the center location setting. We come in line course centers and tracking the numbers, locations, any Earth line. Earth comes out, line rotations in constellation wind pass. Process lines of indication system, all through settings, all through its mapping sequence, and transits and divots and location setting information system. Inside lines, in line rotation settings, and travel communicates to its highways and set correlations. All through travel. Okay. So exactly what I'm giving you guys now is to understand how to be attached and tethered to everything line condition setting, your 5th elements, and your position in your 12 settings. Process lines and line condition setting to your solar system lines, nebula, process line signals into planetary 1, set lines of course centers of 3 travels, endpoint communication lines of graph, of Earth rotation system and travel. All right, so 3 centers, blocking screens, molecule lines of 1, atoms lines of 2, molecule lines of 4, set course centers of 3 centers, into infusion over attractions into all course centers of Earth line 1, Earth line 6, Earth line 12. Okay, very powerful stuff in travel. Course and time change, formation lines of time editing, location setting. Okay, the oscillate lines to lines of one center, travels in 0.3 graph communication setting to travel, right? X2000 comes on standby in 3 centers in a scale into a mothership rotation setting a surface outside the signal. Okay, so setting lines of sonar, flux over 1, and position lines of 2 indicates lights, shades, and shadows of void. Overcross lines and direct signal lines of grounds into line course centers, and direct lines of link and panels of operation. Okay, scales, communication setting, teleportation waves, course centers of nebula, line course centers, and part acceleration lines of time of change. Setting course lines of channel, operation sequence, line condition system. Okay, so we had 3 course lines, 4 lines of measure, and position lines of process lines of pyramid activation 1. So that's a constellation system, and line course centers, and tether operation system, and flux capacitor. Done by equation. Inside rotation system, all 3 calculations. Okay, all done by equation. It's amazing when you see it in all lines of formation system, all 3 transitions, all 3 calculation setting. Okay, so the part acceleration line time frame sets communication setting in seconds, minutes, and hours in frame now. You have pyramid activation lines of 1, 2, and 3, and 4 platforms of travel. Directing ground centers in position location setting to travel in 3 centers of set position existing all at once. 3 centers to scale, cross lines of indication system, all through setting. Operation line course centers of travel. Okay? All through all line rotations and travel in the communication to its wire signatures. The 3 centers it travels in direct lines of link that process set positions to its capillaries and set correlations of time. Okay, so we change the formations of its bridging. 3 centers of bridging locations, right? Directing ground centers of set positions to operation lines of sequence. Now the point lines of graph. See these indication lines and box frames? We add the equation lines of screens, right? Okay, so we time frame, operation line sequence, as correlate to system and travel. 3 centers of angles and 3 scales, all right? Okay, so constellation lines, center line rotations, and center communication center and travel. Indicates docking 1, hangar 2, hangar 6, and hangar 12, and set travel, all right? Sets course centers in location setting and set position. All 3 settings, box frame, triangulation line course centers, inside line conditions. Sets calculation time frame, locks the system at time measure and scale, and sets a webbing system in lights and rotation setting into Skynet. Process the indication system, X2001, X2002, X2003, X2004 in box frames. Okay, correlate the time frame, chest lines of red over signal or red over channel. Process 1, process 2, process 3, process 4 of angles and travel. Sets calculation time frame, sets course centers in metric meters and scale that process communication lines and pixelation graphs and set tractions. All through setting, all through operation. Done by equation. Pixelations come in line centers and rotation system, all through line conditions setting and travel. All through set position, right? Inside rotation line condition setting in its metric meters and set position. Sets course centers in width and process calculation setting a screen. Directing course centers lines at position location and E factors over line. Sets calculations of ground centers of service and line communications outside location of its void. There's the void, there's the inside, there's the void line outside. So we modify the system, line direct signals, lines of indicated setting, laser track centers, webbing sets location system, all through setting. Sets lines of sequence into 12 planetary alignment and sets course lines of channel, indirect signals and link on communications, all through setting. Double equation, all right? All through setup. Laser tractions, all set up, boom. Set signals and location system, all through setting. Sonar echo lines of 1, process lines of 2, 3 lines of measure and scale. Laser track centers, webbing graphs, webbing screens, location setting, 2 planetary alignments, and set solar resistance. Setting ground centers to service location system, all through directions, all through calculations. All in set calculations. All right, so it's inside and outside location now. All through setting, all through operation, all through sequence, all through panel. Okay, it's all set up. All right, so how this all works is to understand how to use a solar line center, laser line, rotation line, connection setting to tether attached and set position location inhibitors. That's an auxiliary lines of 2 endpoints, 2 endpoints, 2 inputs. Graphing center, 0 gravity, 0 calculation, 0 clocking, 0 fields. 4 signals of 3 grounds of Earth, rotation lines of service, outline signal, inside rotations, solar systems now set up in alignment. Okay, setting grounds of service, location system, author travel. Okay, so that's set up in the constellation lines. We have 1 direct signals and 1 ground service and travel. Set lines of flux. There were 3 centers of travel communications, setting a new alignment. Coursing channels of Neptune, process lines of Mercury, process line course centers of blue line, rotation setting, and Jupiter and site tractions. 3 signal lines, ground center line communicates inside hang lines of sequence, line position of panel. 1 set lines, 3 centers, 3 travel communication setting of travel. Set calculations of ground center location setting in process lines, south wind and set tractions. 1, 2, 3, 6, 8, 12, 24, 48, 72, and 144 ground centers of surface. Indicates ground centers location system all through settings of resistors and travel communications. Energetic capsules of pods. Offline settings locations inside in location setting overlapping lines of communication lines of pods. Directing the centers of service location system to its highways and travels indirect lines and ground center location system all through Mercury. Directing the line signals, if you see the line signal location system, you always see it through attractions. The moon. Process lines of the moon. That's processing indicating system all through travel. There's the moon in setting. Okay. There's the moon operation. There's the moon in sequence time frame. 3 centers of travels. Orbiting lines detecting settings of pyramid line rotations positions of 1 center, green line sequence, and 3 measure and scale of communication system all through set positions operation. Signal lines of ground, signal lines of service, location system all through travel. Directing ground centers of 4 lines of measure and scale. Size cross angles. Okay, so we set position lines of measure and scale. Formula lines of box. 3 center lines of 1, operation sequence. Process indicates the system all through travel. Now, as we indicate the flux line, we change communication lines of time frame. Data ports, data line rotations, inside lines, outside travel communications. We have direct line link, and process course centers and dimensional lines of seed potting and travel. Sets course time frame, sets course centers in position of 1 center, 1 traction, 1 division of 2 locations. Set a calculation of ground centers, set position location of its operation line, condition setting, road graph screen adaptations of outer space. Travel point lines of graph, inside line condition setting all through travel. Directing ground centers, line condition setting, operation sequence, and location setting in location system with jump scar. Directing ground centers, process lines of indicates the system all through setting, all through operation, all through sequence, inside travel communications. That's all in inside. All right, so we have to understand how to use the spectrum of outer spectrum, inner location setting of travel. Data formation lines of grounds, high sequence. So let's get an operation line sit lines. Set calculation of ground centers of surface, set position operation lines of sequence lines of panel. Sets calculation of grounds, high sequence lines of blue lines. In lines, outline rotation 3 centers of males and molecule structure of design. Calculate screen adaptations of flux over time measure and scale communication clocking. 0 calculation 1 centers of fields, 0 operation line set course centers, solar panels, communicates setting and travel in track communications. Directing ground centers, high sequence location setting, a string theory and set position on all levels in travel communication system all through set position. Okay, wire indicators, set lines of course centers on time frame. In line, in set lines, cross line, center line, operation sequence lines of panel. Sets crossing angles, 3 centers of signals, location setting of Jupiter and set tractions. Directing ground centers, X marks line rotations and center lines of tubing, process line course centers and line connection system, all through setting of Venus and travel. Venus crossing angles, sets communication lines of time frame, location setting oculars. Directing ground centers, location system, all through travel. Sets communication lines of ground centers, equal line, factors over line, recognition time frame, correlation system, and solar track centers and line communication system, all through travel. Directed signals and location system and travel communications. That my equation. So interchange interconnect setting is outlying wave that processes communication system all through setting. The operation lines, clocking line centers, puts lines at 0 gravity, 0 fields, 0 calculation, 0 foundation setting travels. It's all set up to your planet alignments that's tethered and attached to your system, all through solar system and calculations. All through setting, all through operation sequence and set tractions. Okay? All right, so it's amazing. We're finally coming in coloration out of snowy graph interference. Come to coloration of light metaphors and understand the pattern behavior to really understand how to modify the system of light codes. Directing line course centers, pixelation lines of 1, platforms over 2. Boxing frames come in box lines, triangulation over 2, set lines of 3 signals, and box lines of 4. Okay, so we get in a position of truth and false narratives. Now it gets really interesting from here because we're crossing angles from A to B over C. C equals lines of C equals lines of D. D equals lines of E and set location of factor. Now, directing lines of D over D lines sets the DX lines of settings, process lines of 0, 1, sets 24 lines of measure and 24 lines of scale. Process, and that can make use in setting and travel. Directing lines of box terrain, triangulation of 3 centers, set position lines of 4 over line centers, in position of line conditions 7 and 12 lines of sequence, and a 24 scale of that communication system. Equals lines and set lines, 0 point lines, 0, 0, 7 point lines into 4 locations, into 3 scales. That calculates lines of 7 over tractions, 3 communication system of platforms, direct lines and pyramid, and rotation surface and travel. That equation. Now, setting lines in alignments is a formula equation lines of course centers of set location to a system off the travel. Directing ground centers, we can 18 lines of value. Sets course centers 12 lines of scale. And we have set position of 51 rotations into 35 set square roots in set tractions. Right? Direct lines of 5 signals, 3 centers, 3 track locations setting, 3 measures of scale, process lines of 2, 1 signal, 1 line rotations, and 2 measure and scale, 3 centers of travel. Directing lines in 5 line rotations, 1 center lines of scale, process lines of indication lines of 1 lines, 8 lines of flux, and 4 lines of angles, in rotation system and travel communications. All through setting, all through operations, into your square roots and location setting to your pyramids and traction. That equation. All through your pyramids. So you got process lines of 0 gravity, 0 foundations, 0 energy, 0 clocking, and set travels in 5 line sequence of communication of your planets, directing ground centers and position location system 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 line communication setting and travel. Directing lines into your pyramid activation lines of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 location setting in hieroglyphics. Process line indicating high centers of 45 line angles, crossing angles, and location system, all through traction, all through locations. Done by equation. We're all done now. We're all done. All right, so setting lines of position location, set lines of 5 line of angles, planetary 1, 2, and 3. Set lines, course centers of 3 measure, 3 scale, 3 balance. Location settings and 3 lines of 4. Set lines position of 7 over 12 into 0 lines of 24. Each planetary line now is alignment in your universal system, and constellation lines of center operators lines of time reactors, and set travels of communications. Done by equation. Now we set up the formats and set lines of sequence into time reactors. All through setting, all through operation. Okay, so all your planetary is now in alignment, a 5-line sequence of 12 scale. The process is communication system, all through tractions, all through vector signals, and location system. Sonar and echo and sonar, formation lines of grounds, formation lines of center, operation line sequence, and location system, all through tractions. Done by equation. Now we're done. That was fun. Hope you guys enjoyed that because it's all set up now in your set positions. All through operation, all in sequence, all in panel, all in track locations. Okay? That's it. All right. It's like, woo! Where did it all come from, right? All right, I'll see you guys in set positions in debriefing. Adios.